Moments and then we'll get started. And I'll look to the room first for our court reporter. Are you ready for us to go on the record? You're on mute, but there we go.
Apologies, hearing officer. I've got a new version of Zoom.
Right.
Yes, to go on the record. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll go ahead and get started with our introductions. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. It's September 30th. I am Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the hearing on the pending petition for assignment. Yes, this is correct. I'm sorry. Pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01. And the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, the unassigned portion of 25517, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. The hearing today is being conducted by Zoom. The hearing is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. If you are not planning to speak today and participate, if you would please use the YouTube channel for viewing the hearing rather than logging into the Zoom platform. Both the audio and video of the hearing are being recorded, and we will post the files of the recording in the FTP folder for this proceeding. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If at any time you are experiencing technical difficulties trying to communicate with us or access the Zoom platform, please send an email to the site's email inbox at sites-wr-application@waterboards.ca.gov or to the AHO email inbox. AHO staff are monitoring that inbox and can let me know. And I will put out a brief warning that I seem to be having trouble with my Zoom connection this morning. It's been a little touchy, so I apologize in advance. If I abruptly disappear, that may be why. And if necessary, a member of the AHO team will call a brief recess so that I can reconnect, but hopefully that won't be a problem. We will take breaks today as usual, mid-morning, lunch, mid-afternoon, and we will have a hard stop at 5 p.m. We do once again have Ms. Mullen assisting us with slides and exhibits. So if you are a witness or an attorney today, please feel free to address Ms. Mullen directly to advance a slide or bring up a particular exhibit. I'm not going to call for appearances. I will carry those over from the past, and I will just orient us briefly to where I believe we are, and we can go through and see if we have any procedural matters that we need to address. I believe where we left off was with cross-examination of panel 8, which is our last panel for the authority's case in chief, but it is panel 8 on greenhouse gas emissions with our two witnesses, and we were proceeding through cross-examination. I believe once we complete the examination of those witnesses, we will have completed, as I understand, the authority's case in chief. My intent is not to address the movement of the Sites Authority's exhibits into evidence today. I think we'd like to march forward and get as much as we can done since we have our other witnesses with us today. So my intent would be to move forward and then hear, I believe, opening statements if there is one from the Department of Water Resources. I believe we have not heard from them, although we have heard from the Bureau of Reclamation and also the state water contractors. And then we would proceed from opening statements from the coordinating NGO parties. And it's really up to you whether you want to do all of your opening statements now or how you want to order those. I will turn to you when the time is right, and then we will proceed forward with your first panel of witnesses. I did on Friday issue first and I apologize for this, an amended, I believe it's a fourth amended notice of hearing. And then we did realize there was a version control problem and we issued a corrected fourth amended notice of hearing. So I apologize for that confusion, but I believe the corrected version is in fact correct, hopefully. And I think of note is to take off the in-person element on October 2nd. So on Wednesday, we will not have an in-person portion of this hearing. It will be entirely on the Zoom platform. And then we also added November 4th as a hearing day. So that is officially on the calendar. In addition, I removed a number of the January dates based on the conflict, Mr. Hitchings, that you identified. And I just wanted to make sure, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see that, but if I misunderstood in any way the dates when you were not available, please let me know. But that was my intent, was to take those off calendar. And then we will need, of course, to add dates onto the calendar. And we haven't done that yet, but my intent would be to move the dates forward. So we'd start, now I don't recall whether it was January 23rd, something like that. Mr. Hitchings, I don't know, did you have a chance to look at that, or did you have anything to add?
Yes, good morning. We did we actually had only requested to switch some dates earlier in that month, not to delay, but if that's the preference of the AHO and your preference to start rebuttal on the 24th, we're okay with that. But I just want to make sure there wasn't any misunderstanding of the request that we had made.
Maybe, so this is helpful. This is helpful clarification. My understanding was you were out of the country, but maybe it's that you have a team that can proceed without you. And that may be where this
Yes,
understanding is coming in.
probably better without me, but yes, but we're okay with the change that you've made, but you know, could still also go in line with what our specific requests had been, which is just had been to switch two of the dates.
It was very concise, and I appreciated that, but then I misunderstood. So let me take another look at that. Frankly, I would be inclined to put some of those back on the calendar, the January dates back on the calendar, so that we do keep us on our schedule to the extent that we don't have conflicts from anyone else. But maybe that's what I will put out to all of you. If you have conflicts with the January dates that we originally noticed for rebuttal, this is your chance, a convenient chance to please let me know. Email the AHO or the site's email inbox and let me know, and we can take those into account, and we will be issuing more amended notices of hearing. But fortunately, we have some time. Mr. Reese, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I exactly or fully understand what Mr. Hitchens was asking for, but as I thought I understood it, he was asking to advance or start the proceedings in January before the 9th. And anything earlier and closer to the first of the year is problematic, just because we're so close. So people are traveling, and I have people that are traveling and coming back. You know, the first week of January is tough. So what you've come up with, I like and support. I don't know about others, but just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I agree with the first week of January tends to be challenging for a large group of people. So thank you for that comment. Mr. Busher.
I agree with Mr. Ruiz. The amended, corrected, whatever fourth notice that went out on Friday. I think that makes more sense than trying to squeeze more days into January or start that first week of January, given the holidays and, you know, the work necessary for the rebuttal witnesses and their cases, and then preparation of them and cross. We think it makes sense to start kind of as you laid it out in that amended notice. And I will make sure that we flag any specific dates that are an issue in that notice, but I don't know that there are any.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Busher. Mr. King.
Thank you. So I would just ask if you, as we progress, if you could give myself and probably Mr. Ornbaum some type of notice when our opening statements and our case in chief may be presented. You know, I have the conflict on the 8th and the 21st, and also the afternoon of the 4th. And I can send that. I've mentioned that before, but I can also send that into your office. The other part is that since Che Foca has joined us, they may not be totally familiar with how they can participate going forward. And perhaps at some point it might be good to have them reach out to you and whether or not they're going to make opening statement and present a case in chief. I just mentioned that since they just joined as a party.
Thank you, Mr. King. And just as a point of clarification, I'm not sure if there is a representative from Che Foca. You're welcome to chime in, but I admitted Che Foca band and then the Pesquenta band to participate in this proceeding with limited, what I called limited party status, limited being that we would not go backwards and start with a case in chief. That deadline for submitting case in chief evidence was July 15th. But there is an opportunity going forward on rebuttal to meld into these proceedings, if you will, and present evidence. Although we can certainly make an opportunity for presentation of opening statements as part of this case in chief portion or as part of the rebuttal as those representatives would like to do. So thank you for bringing that up. Are there other, Ms. Dorman, I did receive your email with respect to the availability of the chairman, as I recall. I appreciate that. We can make, I understand the family emergency as I understand, and we can try to schedule in another time. I'm afraid to switch out. I don't have your email up in front of me right now because Zoom has been fussy with me, so I'm just not touching it and leaving it alone. So I can't look at it right at this moment. But I did want to let you know that we did receive it. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, or if
No.
anything is there in email.
Thank you very much for acknowledging it, and we will be in communication with Chairman Mitchum as his family emergency hopefully calms down, and arrange a time for him to testify, ideally within the scope of time that our other case in chief witnesses will be testifying.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I wish him the best in resolving the family emergency. Are there other procedural issues that we should address at this time before we jump back to our panel 8 witnesses? And I will, yes, Mr. Hitchings, please.
Excuse me, sorry about that. Just as far as moving our evidence into the record, is there a date that you would prefer to do that? I know today you want to get through what we have listed so far, but just for planning purposes.
I think it makes sense for this proceeding, and unless you have an objection, I think it makes sense for us to move all of the evidence, the exhibits, into the evidentiary record at the end, actually after we've heard from all of the witnesses for all of the parties. That gives you the maximum amount of time to think about it and everyone else. And then I also find sometimes it's easier to schedule what I call procedure days, where the attorneys gather and take care of these things, where we don't have to schedule with witnesses. So that would be my inclination, unless you have another thought about it.
No, I think that sounds fine to do that. One thing I just want to flag, we may have some scope objections, the scope of the testimony with regard to some of the protestants' witnesses. And so we would intend to address those as we start the cross-examination of them.
Yeah,
that
makes sense. Thank you, Mr. Hitchings, for letting me know.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Busher, did you have something to add on this?
No, if we're doing all of the evidence at the same time at a later date, we can discuss that sometime later. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. King.
So then just around that issue, whether or not we can also move in the protests themselves into the record. You mentioned that you would consider that, but for us, we'd like to make sure our protest is fully included also.
Yes, so thank you for bringing that up, Mr. King. My intent would be, at the time we move the parties' exhibits into the evidentiary record and consider the movement of the exhibits into the evidentiary record, would be also to consider the AHO exhibits and moving those into the evidentiary record. We titled them AHO exhibits for convenience, so that we wouldn't, these were documents that we thought multiple parties may refer to. They're not sponsored by the AHO in any way. So my point being, objections are welcome to moving any of those exhibits as well. But my thought would be that we handle those along with the parties' exhibits, and we'd have just an evidentiary day of it.
Right. I wanted to just mention, at the time of our protest, we weren't aware there was this would be an AHO proceeding, and so our expectation that they would be part of the record, and probably that was for Mr. Ornbaum also, but just want to mention that.
Well, they're certainly part of the administrative record,
Okay.
so they will be part of any record that is certified for if there's judicial review of this proceeding. They're definitely part of the administrative record, and then my intent would be to pose that they be moved into the evidentiary record, and then we would hear if there are any objections to any portion of those.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Are there other procedural issues we should address this morning? Then with that, I will look to the coordinating NGO parties as we bring up the two witnesses for panel 8. I believe we had left off with cross-examination. Mr. Busher, are you up?
So I think Ms. Mers had a few questions, and if she does not cover the couple of questions I have, I will follow her.
Great. So we'll start with Ms. Mertz and then Mr. Busher. And first, I'll welcome our witnesses. Welcome back, Mr. Mitsui and Dr. Jaglo. Do you recall when we met last taking the oath with respect to this proceeding?
I do.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will hand things over to you, Ms. Mertz.
Good morning, Mr. Matsui, Ms. Jaglo. I'm Keiko Mertz here on behalf of Friends of the River, and I just have a few questions for you this morning. First, could we pull up Exhibit FOR 170, please?
And that was FOR 170?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And if we could scroll to page 2. Excellent, thank you. And maybe if we could zoom in just to that table up there on the top. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Mr. Matsui, do you recall testifying on Wednesday that you helped prepare this document?
I do.
Great, thank you. So according to this table, the greenhouse gas emissions from facility decommissioning were excluded from the site's authority's greenhouse gas analysis, correct?
That's correct. There's no decommissioning emissions included in the analysis.
Thank you. Were you asked to estimate emissions from facility decommissioning at any point?
Could you specify asked by who? Or
Sure. In your work with the site's project authority, did they ever ask you to estimate facility decommissioning as an emission source?
I don't recall that happening.
Wonderful. And were you ever part of any discussions internally that considered including facility decommissioning as an emission source?
I don't recall any specific discussions about that.
Great. And then same for the emission source decay of organic matter on exposed banks. This emissions category was excluded from the site's authority greenhouse gas analysis, correct?
Yes, I guess I would say that I testified to this last week, but we followed the IPCC guidelines, so I'm not sure I would use the word excluded. We included what was appropriate based on those guidelines.
So in your words, that category was not included, correct?
That's correct.
Were you ever asked by the site's project authority to estimate this emissions category?
I don't recall being asked that.
And were you ever part of any discussions internally that considered including exposed banks as an emissions category in the analysis?
Not that I recall.
Thank you. So also according to this table, the category carbon leakage, which is line 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, was also not included in the site's greenhouse gas analysis performed by you, correct?
That's correct.
Did the site's project authority ever ask you to estimate emissions from carbon leakage?
No, not that I recall.
And were you ever part of any internal discussions that considered including carbon leakage as an emission source?
Not that I recall.
Thank you. And then just quickly reviewing from last week, under the footnote 2, do you agree that that lists 3 additional sources of emissions that were not included in the analysis?
I'm sorry, did you say, do I agree with footnote 2?
I said, do you agree that footnote 2 lists 3 additional sources of emissions that were not included in the site's project authority greenhouse gas analysis?
I see. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So then today we've identified 6 emission sources that were not included in the site's authority's estimate of greenhouse gas emissions. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so. Again, those emission sources aren't part of the IPCC guidelines, but as identified in this table, those emission sources were not included.
Thank you. So omitting these 6 sources of emissions from the analysis would result in undercounting project emissions, correct?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained. I would try that a different way, Ms. Mertz.
In your experience, Mr. Matsui, if in an emissions analysis, categories of emissions are excluded, will the resulting estimate of emissions be an undercount?
I think sort of that question kind of answers itself. If there are things that you're opting not to include, then it's possible that the total would be lower. However, again, I testified to this last week, but what we've included is reasonably foreseeable.
Thank you. And then my last question in this line of questioning is, in your experience, if project emissions are underestimated, it would follow that mitigation as currently proposed would not be sufficient to address the additional emissions. Is that correct?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll overruled. Go ahead and answer.
Well, I mean, it does feel kind of speculative because some sources could result in reductions, right? And then, that would make the project more beneficial from an emissions standpoint. So I can't really answer it definitively.
Thank you, Mr. Matsui. For this next line of questioning, whichever is best fit to answer, please chime in. And could we bring up AHO 223, please? And could we scroll to page 9, please? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Do you recall testifying on Wednesday, I believe it was Mr. Matsui, that the alpha value of this formula is a multiplier?
I recall that conversation, but I honestly can't remember if I answered or it was Dr. Jaglow. I'm sort of thinking it was Dr. Jaglow, but perhaps she might recall.
Yeah, I think we did discuss that. That was me. Yes.
Thank you. And what is the range of values that could have been chosen for alpha? Speaking of minimum and maximum here.
It's in a different table. I don't have that table memorized. One, it was chosen as it's a default for the analysis, and given that this is a projection for Reservoir that has not yet been built, the conservative thing to do is to just go with the default tier one value, which is a 1.
I appreciate the answer, Ms. Jaglow, but I asked about what the potential range of those values could be.
It is in one of the tables, but I don't have the table memorized.
Okay, can we bring up another exhibit briefly? It's exhibit FOR 251, page 15. And if we could scroll down a little bit more to table 7.11. You recall stating that you used IPCC guidelines in performing this analysis, correct?
I did not perform the analysis, but yes, IPCC guidelines were followed in performing the analysis.
Mr. Matsui, did you perform this part of the analysis?
I did not.
Okay. Can either of you clarify who did perform this part of the analysis?
Yeah, for this analysis in Appendix 21A, it was the modeling team employed by AECOM.
Okay, so do you recall reviewing this table last Wednesday?
I do.
Thank you. Would you agree that the last column to the right here represents the range of alpha values that could have been used in that formula?
Yes.
Thank you. So can you describe the characteristics of a water body that has the minimum alpha value? In this case, let's say the 0.7 value.
Yes, so according to the IPCC, you look at these multiple factors, which has how much chlorophyll there is, how much nitrogen there is, the depth, how much phosphorus there is. So there are multiple factors to determine the trophic index.
Thank you. I'm asking more specifically about like what kind of water body would have that. For example, based on this methodology, would you agree that a pristine mountain stream would have a very low value such as 0.7?
It's really hard to say because we're talking about a biological system or, in terms of an ecosystem, and there are a bunch of different factors. So I could envision cases where it would be that, and I can envision cases where it would be something else, just depending upon a bunch of factors.
Thank you. And hypothetically, a low elevation reservoir with high nutrient loads and high algal loads would have a higher alpha factor. Is that correct?
Objection beg. Higher than what?
Let me clarify. Would have an alpha factor that's higher in this range that we've identified as the range of potential alpha factors, perhaps 5 to 25 identified here.
This table is sort of like sequential, right? So yes, the more chlorophyll you have, which would be indicated potentially by algae, and the more phosphorus and nitrogen you have, then yes, you would get to a higher trophic class if you also take into account the Secchi depth.
Thank you. Yet the modeling team used an alpha factor of 1 to calculate methane emissions, the emission source methane emissions from lands converted to flooded lands for Sites Reservoir. Isn't that correct?
The IPCC default in cases where you don't have any of these data, which we can't possibly have because the reservoir has not been built, it is 1. So yes, they use the IPCC guidance for in a default situation where you don't have these data of 1.
Thank you. Could the modeling team have accessed data for the source water from the Sacramento River?
I don't know the sequence of events of when data were gathered versus when the modeling was done.
Thank you. And are you aware of whether the modeling team was ever asked to perform an analysis using an alpha value greater than 1?
I'm going to go to Corey on that one. I don't know.
No, I don't recall them being asked to use a different value because that would deviate from the default IPCC approach, which, as we've, I think, made clear, we feel is not appropriate.
Thank you. And were there ever, do either of you recall any internal discussions considering an alpha value, using an alpha value greater than 1, incorporating information about source water?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled. We can clarify this.
I can't recall any discussions of that nature.
Thank you both. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Ms. Mertz. With that, I will turn to you, Mr. Busher.
Thank you very much, Hearing Officer Kinsey, Mr. Matsui, Dr. Jaglow. My name is Eric Busher. I'm an attorney at San Francisco Baykeeper. Thank you both for being here again today. I've just got a couple of questions. Mr. Matsui, I think you said something to this effect on Friday, and then you mentioned the modeling team from AECOM this morning. Was that the group of people who were unavailable to testify that you referred to on Friday?
That's correct.
Okay.
Or it was Tuesday, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm having a tough time with days, apparently. But yes, thank you. And then you talked a lot about in your testimony about the kind of uncertainty involved in the modeling for the emissions and for the mitigation. I want to make sure I understand that, right? So there's significant uncertainty in part because the reservoir is not built about what the total emissions from the project will be, correct?
I'm sorry, could you clarify uncertainty? I was referring to uncertainty with respect to the ARES report prepared for the project.
So yeah, no, I appreciate that, but right, in your own analysis, there is uncertainty about the total emissions from the project, correct?
That's correct.
And there's uncertainty about the amount of emissions that any of the on-site mitigation actions would limit or decrease, correct?
That's correct. That's why there's a multi-tiered mitigation strategy that, will kick to the offsite measures and then to the offsets.
Correct. And there's uncertainty about the effectiveness of those off-site measures as well, correct?
I don't know if I would say about the effectiveness. I mean, I can't really answer. There's no specific measures that have been identified at this time.
So it's fair to say that if we don't know what those off-site measures will be, that may or may not occur in the future, there is uncertainty about how much emissions they will remove or reduce, correct?
Objection vague. Let's focus on specific measures. They're listed in the mitigation measure as examples.
I think that's fair, Mr. Busher.
Well, let me try it this way. Are you aware of any consequence or resulting limitation that the project would operate under if the net emissions were greater than 0?
Do you mean after implementation of the mitigation measure GHG 1.1?
Correct.
Well, I mean, the mitigation measure is a legal requirement. So that must be met.
Can you explain to me what that legal requirement means in your mind?
I'm afraid
Who's going to call for a legal conclusion? I mean, he can offer an opinion, I guess.
He just said it was a legal requirement. I want to understand what he means by that. I'm not asking for what the law says or not.
That's fair. Go ahead, Mr. Mitsui.
Well, I guess I would say the authority is obligated to implement the mitigation measures as written in the environmental documents.
Okay. And those mitigation measures are not proposed as conditions on the authority's water rights permit, correct?
I'm afraid I'm not sure.
And in your mind, in your understanding, what is the consequence if those mitigation measures, as described in the CEQA documentation, are insufficient to get to 0 emissions? Is there any limitation that automatically kicks in on the project's operations at that point?
I mean, I can't think of any specific limitations that would kick in.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Busher. Looking to the coordinating NGO parties, are there other representatives who have questions for this witness? And I'm trying to pull up my gallery view here. That'll go down the list. Mr. Rees, I see you're on camera. Do you have questions?
That's just to tell you that I don't have questions.
Great, perfect. Then I will look generally to the room. Are there any other parties who have questions for this panel of witnesses? Then with that, back to you, Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Hitchings. Do you have redirect for these witnesses?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Mr. Matsui, do you recall Ms. Tinney asking you questions with respect to prioritization of GHG reduction strategies?
Yes.
And I believe you indicated that if the authority can provide substantial evidence indicating that one of the higher priorities is not feasible, it can move on to the next priority. Can you please explain how this analysis would work?
Yes. As noted on AHO 88, page 21-20, the authority would conduct a feasibility analysis, and to do so, the authority would rely on the definition of feasible under CEQA. Under Public Resources Code, section 21061.1, feasible means, quote, capable of being accomplished in a successful manner within a reasonable period of time, taking into account economic, environmental, social, and technological factors. To support this feasibility analysis, the authority would need to develop substantial evidence to support its ultimate determination of feasibility or infeasibility. And the CEQA guidelines define substantial evidence as, quote, enough relevant information and reasonable inferences from this information that a fair argument can be made to support a conclusion, even though other conclusions might also be reached. That's from CEQA guidelines section 15384A. Further, substantial evidence includes, quote, facts, reasonable assumptions predicated upon facts, and expert opinions supported by facts. And that's from CEQA guidelines section 15384B.
Great, thank you very much. Ms. Tinney further asked you about who this substantial evidence would be reported to and who makes the ultimate feasibility determination. You mentioned that you were not entirely sure, but that perhaps the substantial evidence would be presented to a judge. Do you recall that exchange?
Yes.
Since the hearing last week, have you had an opportunity to further consider who this evidence would be presented to and who would make the ultimate decision regarding feasibility?
Sorry, yeah, I have. I anticipate that the substantial evidence would be presented to the authority or the reservoir committee that would need to decide based on substantial evidence that a higher priority strategy is infeasible. So ultimately, the authority board or reservoir committee would make the determination, probably as part of development of its GHG reduction plan and during the 5-year updates to that plan.
Great, thank you. Do you recall an exchange with Ms. Tinney regarding inclusion of facilities decommissioning as a source of emissions in the authority's GHG analysis?
Yes.
And do you recall that you indicated that decommissioning is outside the scope of this project and it was not necessary to take a closer look at that source of emissions?
Yes.
Can you please explain what more specifically what you meant by decommissioning being outside the scope of this analysis?
Yes. Since last week, I've confirmed some of my initial thoughts on the life expectancy of the project, which for a well-constructed and well-maintained dam could be 100 years. And this time horizon is well beyond the horizon of the CEQA analysis, and in this respect is beyond the scope of the analysis for the project.
Great. Do you recall a discussion with Ms. Tinney regarding the role of a third-party expert in helping the authority assess and implement GHG reduction strategies?
Yes.
Would you further explain the authority's anticipated role of this third-party expert?
The authority will require the expertise of a third-party expert consultant to help it implement its GHG reduction plan. As I mentioned last week, and is further explained in AHO 88, page 21-26, I anticipate a role for the third-party expert in developing and implementing the annual monitoring program, assessing availability of GHG reduction strategies consistent with the authority's priorities for the measures, the strategies, and reviewing and updating the GHG reduction plan every 5 years for authority board or reservoir committee approval. Given the highly technical and specialized nature of GHG emissions and reduction strategies, it is necessary for the authority to employ this expert. And ultimately, the authority will approve the GHG reduction plan.
Mr. Matsui, do you recall Ms. Tinney asking you whether there is anything in the GHG mitigation measures that would preclude off-site measures from being international?
Yes.
And you mentioned that there's nothing prohibiting off-site measures from being international, but that you would anticipate it being very unlikely, given the need to work through the prioritization process and show with substantial evidence that the higher priorities could not be met.
Yes, that's correct.
Can you please further explain your opinion that you would anticipate international offsite measures being very unlikely to be used?
Yeah, as stated on AHO 88, page 21-20, there are 5 location tiers to work through before international offsite measures would even be an option for the authority. And those are 1, within the project footprint, 2, within communities in the vicinity of the project site, 3, in the Sacramento Valley Air Basin, 4, in the state of California, and 5, in the United States. And I anticipate that there will be feasible offsite measures available in these tiers such that international offsite measures would not likely be needed.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Jagler, I'm going to move to you for a few questions. Dr. Jagler, do you recall Ms. Tinney's questions regarding sites reservoir nutrient levels and the trophic level used in equation 5 contained in EIR-EIS Appendix 21A?
Yes.
And you recall that Ms. Tinney prefaced her questions about the expected trophic level with questions about the anticipated nutrient level in the site's reservoir, as stated on pages 62 and 80 of the site's EIR-EIS Chapter 6?
Yes.
Is there a relationship between nutrient levels and the trophic level selected for that equation?
Do you mean in the analysis or just in general?
Yeah, more generally.
Generally speaking, we just looked at table, I think it's 7.11, and certainly nutrient level are some of the factors that play into the trophic level of a lake. There are multiple factors, but they are factors that do play into trophic levels, yes.
And do you recall Ms. Tinney, again, looking at pages 62 and 80 of the Chapter 6 of the EIR-EIS, asking you questions about when the nutrient levels are likely to be highest in the site's reservoir?
Yes.
And do you recall that based on the language in the EIR, they're likely to be those nutrient levels are likely to be relatively higher during initial filling?
Yes.
So is it your opinion that in the case that perhaps nutrient levels would be at a level that may lead you to conclude that the trophic level should be higher than 1, is it possible that those levels would only be present during the initial filling of the reservoir?
Objection, leading and vague.
I'll overrule it. We're eliciting direct testimony and I'll allow it here.
So generally speaking, nutrient levels in areas where there are agriculture, they fluctuate, right? Depending upon farmer activities and weather and other things. And according to reading the chapter on water, the write-up explained that nutrient levels would likely be highest in the beginning, and then over time, they would decrease and they would be diluted down.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I will look then to the room for any recross. I don't see Ms. Tinney on the
Yeah.
line.
Excuse me, Miss Tinney was unavailable today, and I do have a couple recross questions though.
Go ahead, Mr. Busher, please.
Mr. Matsui, you mentioned the Reservoir Committee and the Sites Authority Board as being the two entities who would consider whether things were infeasible or feasible in the mitigation process. What's your understanding of who's in charge, right? Is the Reservoir Committee above the Authority Board, or is the Authority Board in charge? Can you describe that?
I can't speak in detail to the organizational structure and the decision-making process, I can't speak to, the interaction between those two terms.
Okay. At the beginning of your redirect examination, you gave reference to some CEQA guidelines. Did you research those this weekend or since you were last here?
Which part of my redirect testimony specifically?
I think it was the first thing Mr. Ferguson asked you. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
Do you mean, so I cited a couple of definitions, feasible, substantial evidence? Yes, I did look those up.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned a third-party expert that's going to be involved with performing or determining the mitigation that is appropriate. Do we know who that third-party expert is?
No.
Okay. And then you talked about the life expectancy of the reservoir. Can you tell me how you determined that the life expectancy of the reservoir would be at least 100 years?
Yeah, I found a report from United Nations University Institute on environment, health, and water that substantiated my initial thoughts. It said that well-maintained and well-constructed dams can easily reach 100 years.
Is there anything in that report specific to the Sites Reservoir project?
I don't see why there would be, but I did not find anything. Yeah.
Okay. And you said that 100 years is beyond the scope of CEQA's guidelines, correct?
I don't believe I said that.
Sorry, I misheard then. 100 years, because that is so far in the future, was beyond the scope of the CEQA analysis that was performed, correct?
I would say yes. Yeah.
And is that because CEQA doesn't, in your understanding, CEQA doesn't require you to look that far into the future?
CEQA requires that the analysis of environmental impacts be reasonably foreseeable, and it does not require speculation. Okay. And yeah, I feel like, in my opinion, 100 years, that does not fall within what's reasonably foreseeable.
Okay. Did you do any analysis with respect to the greenhouse gas emissions that was outside of that CEQA process?
The entirety of the GHG analysis is included in the EIR, EIS, and its appendices.
And so there was no additional greenhouse gas analysis with respect to the water rights or the water code or anything else that may contemplate analysis farther out than CEQA does. Is that fair?
That's right, because it's still speculative, right? Even outside of CEQA, it's trying to estimate emissions in 100 years is, I think, would lead to probably erroneous information and would not be useful for decision makers. So that's correct.
What about 50 years? Is that too far out?
Well, are you talking about decommissioning?
Well, maybe I misunderstood your answer. I mean, I understand this came up in the context of the decommissioning analysis, but I understood your response to be 100 years is just too far into the future to responsibly predict what is going to happen. and therefore we didn't do that analysis. Is that fair?
Generally, yes.
Okay. Is 50 years too far out?
I'm not sure what specific analysis you're referring to. The EIS shows annual emissions, and it shows the downward trajectory of those emissions because for a couple of reasons, but the energy sector will increase its renewables, and thus the energy emissions will decrease. So what we've shown in the environmental document is the downward trajectory of the operational emissions.
Is there a time frame when that trajectory or any of your other analysis becomes too speculative, or is it only decommissioning after 100 years that falls in that bucket?
I can't come up with an exact timeline, but again, what we've shown is conservative and reasonably foreseeable.
No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Busher. Ms. Mertz, did you have any additional questions given that limited redirect? I wasn't sure if Mr. Busher was speaking on behalf of the entire collective.
Sorry, I
No,
was not.
I don't,
If
Ms.
others
Cindy.
do.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I heard Ms. Mertz, you do not have anything else, and Mr. Busher, you were politely saying you don't necessarily speak on behalf of everyone.
Correct. You heard correctly on my end. Thank you, Ms. Kenzie.
Thank you. With that, then I believe we have reached the end of this panel. First of all, I want to thank you, both of you, for returning to us this morning, and thank you for your testimony, and I appreciate your participation here. And with that, I'll look to you, Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Hitchings. Does that complete the presentation of the authority's case in chief?
It does.
Thank you. I believe from here, as I mentioned, we would go to opening statements. Mr. Soderlund, is your intent to present any kind of opening statement or any kind of statement from the Department of Water Resources?
Yeah, I have a short statement.
I think now is a good time, so please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Presiding Officer Kinsey. My name is Eric Soderlund, appearing on behalf of the Department of Water Resources. While the department's not presenting a case in chief in this hearing, we would like to say, after reviewing the testimony and exhibits submitted thus far, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight two important points that I believe are supported by the evidence before you. First, I would like to highlight the importance of the water rights settlement term that was negotiated between the site's authority, the department, and the state water contractors. While discussions between sites and the department and the Bureau of Reclamation regarding operational coordination are ongoing, the department is confident that the settlement term, along with the evidence submitted by the site's authority, demonstrates that the site's project can be operated in a manner that does not conflict with the department's ability to operate the state water project and operate it consistent with its water rights, obligations, and regulatory requirements. The settlement term, which provides broader protections to the department than just a term 91, so it's a term 91 plus of sorts. This term will also ensure that the site's diversions will only be made after in-basin use demands and the department regulatory requirements are met. Second, the evidence submitted by the site's authority demonstrates that the export of site's project water at SWP facilities or state water project facilities will be well within the constraints of the department's water rights terms and conditions and other regulatory requirements, all developed to protect the other legal users of water and fish and wildlife. The evidence does not support the need for additional terms or conditions to be placed on the rediversions of sites project water or otherwise place unnecessary obligations on the department. And with that, that's the opening statement for the Department of Water Resources, and I appreciate the opportunity to make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soderlund. I believe next we are ready to turn to the coordinating NGO parties. Do you have opening statements that you're planning to present at this time? I look to you first, Mr. Busher, only because you're off mute.
Yeah, we do, and I would request before we begin if Dr. Curti or a representative of the Calusa tribe is with us. They had requested to give a land acknowledgement before we gave our opening statements, and then there will be 4 of us with brief opening statements.
All right, we can do that. I will look to the room, either Dr. Curti or another representative, if you would like to make a statement at this time. Welcome, Dr. Curti. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Dr. Giorgio Hattie Curti. I'm a sociocultural geographer and critical ethnographer, and I work with and for the Cachel-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community and its constitutional governing body, the Calusa Indian Community Council. It is customary and respectful among tribal communities to offer a land acknowledgement of where the proceedings or a project is geographically situated or taking place, and we honor this practice and obligation today. Since time immemorial, the people of the Calusa tribe have lived in intimate and indelible relationship with the proposed sites,
I'm sorry,
project
Dr.
areas.
Georgia.
I apologize.
I apologize. This is the reporter. This is going way too fast for me. I've dropped a lot of it.
What was the question?
Dr. Curti, we just need you, I think,
I can't hear.
slow down,
Okay.
if you would, please, for the reporter, so we can get this.
And I have dropped a lot of this. I've been trying to interrupt. Apologies.
And I apologize, Dr. Curti, if you don't mind starting again and a little more, well, a fair amount more slowly, so we can make sure that it makes it into the record. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Giorgio Hattie Curti. I'm a sociocultural geographer and critical ethnographer, and I work with and for the Cachel-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community and its constitutional governing body, the Calusa Indian Community Council. It is customary and respectful among tribal communities to offer a land acknowledgement of where the proceedings or a project is geographically situated or taking place, and we honor this practice and obligation today. Since time immemorial, the people of the Calusa tribe have lived in intimate and indelible relationship with the proposed sites, project areas, lands, airs, and waters, and all the life that these lands, airs, and waters embodied and have helped to maintain and sustain. These lands, airs, and waters have nourished, healed, protected, and been vital parts of the familial, cultural, social, and knowledge systems of the people of the Calusa tribe for many, many, many generations and continue to be today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Curti. I see a hand from what is titled Melissa's iPhone. Is that an intended hand? Did you have something to say? Maybe an errant hand. With that, back to you.
I apologize.
That's okay. Mr. Busher.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Kenzie. There will be myself and then Mr. Schutz, Mr. Spain, and Mr. Mulcahy will also have brief opening statements.
Thank you.
Good morning,
Please,
members.
go ahead.
Sorry. Good morning, members of the board, Board Member Firestone, members of the public, parties, and council. My name is Eric Busher. I'm an attorney at San Francisco Baykeeper. And on behalf of Baykeeper, Golden State Salmon Association, and Defenders of Wildlife, and in support of the coordinating tribal and NGO parties, I want to begin by thanking the board for the opportunity to give an opening statement. And I want to give a special thanks to the hearing office staff, especially Ms. Mullen, for all of your work the last several and next several weeks in this process. As I begin this morning, I'm going to ask you to keep 3 things in mind as you hear the evidence that we will collectively present, and as I preview what that evidence will show. First, much of what is at issue here are public trust resources and impacts to them. Second, in assessing those impacts, especially whether they are reasonable, the board's decisions must be grounded in science, which includes Indigenous knowledge. And third, stepping back, I'd ask that you contemplate and think about the assumptions the context, and the history that come with your responsibility to evaluate the claim that there is excess or available water. With that context, I'll turn to the project and to the evidence that we will present. If approved, the project would divert water that would otherwise remain in the Sacramento River and flow into and through the Delta to San Francisco Bay and Pacific Ocean. Those flows and the fish populations that depend on healthy rivers and ecosystems are public trust resources. And while the site's authority relies on the alleged public benefits of the project, the board must also remember that harms to fish, wildlife, and water quality are equally public harms. In this regard, you will hear testimony about the dire condition of the San Francisco estuary and the Bay Delta ecosystem. This will include testimony about the 7 native fish in the watershed that are listed as candidate, threatened, or endangered species under state and federal law, and about how the abundance of those species, like winter run Chinook salmon, which once supported commercial and tribal fisheries, continue to decline despite, in some cases, decades of Endangered Species Act protection, to the point that they are now on the verge of extinction. This will also include evidence about species that are not listed as endangered, like fall run Chinook salmon, that have supported fisheries, but have seen those fisheries declining and closed for 2 years running, and about the impacts of those closures. You will hear testimony about how sites authorities' proposed construction and operations will harm aquatic and terrestrial species, including endangered ones, in and around the proposed reservoir and throughout the watershed. And you will hear testimony about alternatives that the site's authority never truly considered, ways that water users participating in the project could address water supply concerns without site's reservoir and with significantly less harm to public trust resources. The evidence of the ecological crisis in the Delta and the alternatives available throughout the state will demonstrate that the project's harms to public trust resources are both unreasonable and avoidable. Now, in assessing and understanding, right, what is reasonable or unreasonable, it is imperative that the board be guided by science. We'd ask that you listen to what the witnesses say about the best available science, not just statistical data and analysis, but also biological evidence from traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. We ask that you consider the biological significance, the actual impacts on wildlife and people, and that you remember that no amount of data or analysis or complicated math can make those impacts any less real, harmful, or consequential to the people and wildlife who will suffer as a result. You will hear testimony explaining why analysis of the project's impacts must consider the entirety of a watershed in crisis, not just isolated reaches of it, in order to understand and account for the project's consequences. And you will hear testimony explaining the wealth of evidence that shows that flows in the Sacramento River, different and generally greater than the Wilkins Slough limit proposed by the site's authority, offer necessary and well-documented benefits to fish and wildlife. Now, zooming out a little bit from the detail, the board is being asked to determine whether there is excess water or water available for diversion. In making that determination, we ask that you consider the underlying implication of the inquiry, along with the history, perspective, and context that comes with it. All diversions of water have consequences. There is no free lunch. From a fish's view, none of the water that is in stream is excess. It is just their world. And in understanding what is excess or available, the question we really must answer is how much damage are we willing to tolerate to our riparian and marine ecosystems? How long are we willing to perpetuate the inequity at the foundation of California's water rights and water allocations decisions? Those are the questions the board must confront in the choices it makes in this proceeding. In doing so, listen to what the evidence says about that excess water, about how it benefits fish, how it supports tribal beneficial uses, how it is part of unadjudicated tribal water rights, how it helps to protect water quality and people. And consider the present context and the history of that inquiry. Listen to what the witnesses say about what we have lost. Listen to what the witnesses say about what our state has taken away from other people. Listen to what the witnesses say about what we are on a path to lose, and let that evidence and testimony of the history and the context be a guide in understanding what we could have if we stopped tolerating harm and exploitation of the Delta and stopped perpetuating inequity. In this regard, you will hear testimony about the impact of limiting consideration of water availability to the state board's database of water rights, how that ignores historical context and excludes tribes, leaves out reserved water rights that have yet to be adjudicated, and relies on and perpetuates a system rooted in genocide, violence, and exclusion. You'll hear testimony about why, in order to understand the impacts and the necessary protections for fish and water quality, the watershed, the rivers, the delta, the bay, and well beyond the legally defined delta must be considered as a dynamic whole, not as static points in place or time. You'll hear testimony about why the use of existing regulatory conditions to determine whether water is available to divert was fundamentally flawed, based on old paradigms that have put us on a path to destruction. And you will hear that those existing regulations are not protective of public trust resources, of fish and wildlife beneficial uses, and contain no protection whatsoever for tribal beneficial uses. In total, this evidence will be clear. We will demonstrate that the Bay Delta estuary and its tributaries are experiencing an ecological crisis, devastating the communities in the watershed who rely on clean, healthy, thriving rivers, including environmental justice communities and tribes that have lived with the land and the water for time immemorial. We will show that this crisis has been repeatedly acknowledged by the State Water Resources Control Board, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Why is the Delta in a crisis? Again, the evidence will be clear. The primary cause of this crisis is the dams and diversions of water that already exist in the watershed, a conclusion which the evidence will show has been acknowledged by those same state and federal experts and is supported by the best available science, including indigenous knowledge. And ultimately, that evidence will show that the diversions proposed by the site's authority in wetter years and from isolated large storm events in dry ones, and the subsequent release of that water will hurt fish and wildlife, will have real and negative impacts on water quality of already impaired waters, like increased mercury and more harmful algal blooms, and will cause unnecessary and wholly avoidable harm to public trust resources and to the public interest. As such, we believe the evidence will dictate that the application be denied in its entirety. But if the application is approved, the board's obligations do not change or end. And in that case, the board must act to cabin the project's operations in order to minimize and avoid those harms. Now, the authority's proposals in this regard are understandably limited to restrictions on operations that do not upset the economic viability of the project. But the science is not so constrained. And based on that science, you will hear a very different story. Some of the project's harms can be avoided when attempts to do so are untethered from whether it would make the water too expensive. The science and the evidence will point to necessary requirements on sites authorities' operations that are substantially and materially different from what the authority proposes. Should the application be granted, the board's restrictions on operations in the form of permit conditions must be guided by that evidence. We look forward to sharing our evidence with you in the coming days and weeks, and again ask that you consider it in the context of the watershed and the ecosystem in a way that recognizes and remembers the history, that accounts for the competing uses of water, including tribal water rights and tribal and environmental beneficial uses, in order to ensure that the board's decisions protect rather than harm public trust resources. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Busher. I would like to continue. I believe Mr. Busher indicated, Mr. Schutz, that you would be next to speak with us. So please go ahead when you're ready, Mr. Schutz.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Hearing Officer Kenzie, Board Member Firestone, staff of the AHO and the State Water Board, and others here today. I am Chris Schutz, Executive Director of Protestant California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. In most respects, Sites Reservoir, as proposed, is indeed your grandfather's reservoir. In some respects, it is worse. You will hear NGO testimony that situates Sites Reservoir in the history of the development of California's water resources. Sites is a water export project. It seeks to export what is deemed surplus or excess water from the northern parts of the Central Valley to areas of deficiency, primarily in the southern parts of the state. There is nothing new about this. It reproduces the century-old water planning concept that more water is available from the Delta without consequence. The NGO's testimony documents the structural overallocation of the State Water Project due to the designation of North Coast rivers under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It documents an insatiable pattern of dam construction, new water development, and further dam construction. It demonstrates that the most recent coordinated plans for the state's water, including those produced by the current state administration, have not come to terms with the need to bring demand into balance with supply. The Sites Project proposes to extensively use Central Valley Project and State Water Project export facilities. Its partners are the state and federal projects and a number of prominent state water project contractors. It is proposing a place of use consistent with the CVP and SWP. It is proposing to use a state filing for a facility originally conceived to be an SWP facility. The majority of its initial planning work was done by DWR. Yet the Sites Project does not incorporate the responsibilities of the CVP and SWP that came with the comprehensive development plans that conceived the CVP and SWP. The Sites Project does not propose affirmative contribution to maintaining Delta water quality, even for water stored in Sites Reservoir by DWR and reclamation. Nor does the Sites Project propose priorities for area of origin uses. The Sites Project seeks a place of use that is equivalent to the enormous combined place of use of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. As laid out in the testimony, this place of use would effectively build water transfers into the water right itself and would thus institutionalize a water market due to the structure of a water right. In this respect, it is worse than your grandfather's reservoir. You will hear testimony that demonstrates a simple mathematical and physical reality. The effects of sites diversions on the Sacramento River hydrograph will be greatest when flows are at the bottom end of the range of divertible flows. You will see how sites diversions would truncate flow pulses and flatten the Sacramento River hydrograph in below normal, dry, and critically dry water years. Sites diversions would also behead the Sacramento River hydrograph from April 1st through June 15th in all water year types. You will hear how, on an annual basis, sites diversions would on average be greater in volume than the purported flow additions under the proposed voluntary agreements in above normal years. On an annual basis, sites diversions would reduce purported flow additions under the voluntary agreements in below normal years by an average of 2/3. You will hear testimony about the systemic overallocation of water to CVP and SWP settlement contractors and to CVP exchange contractors. This overallocation and Reclamation's interpretation of its contract obligations makes the purported benefits to salmon of potential exchanges between Shasta Reservoir and Sites Reservoir unreliable. Furthermore, there is no agreement between Reclamation and the Sites Authority for such exchanges, and no clear plan for implementing such exchanges for the touted but undefined benefit of flexibility when it comes to fish. You will hear how climate change will likely reduce water available to the project. In combination with flows evaluated by the State Water Board to protect fish and wildlife, water available to the project would be reduced by 57% over the alternative modeled by sites proponents. Storage operations will cause poor water quality. Climate change will make it worse. You will hear how Sites Authority underestimates greenhouse gas emissions from the operation and maintenance of the proposed project. You will hear testimony about defining the public interest and how poorly Sites measures up. Sites Reservoir is unaffordable for agriculture and unneeded for declining urban demand. Sites would displace opportunities for cost-effective investment in alternative water supplies. You will hear testimony from a wildlife expert who conducted actual observations of wildlife in southern and eastern parts of the project area. Based on the 60 species detected and on older surveys, he estimates that 152 species of vertebrate wildlife would be directly affected by the site's project, an exceptionally large number in his extensive experience. He estimates that Sites Reservoir would destroy 87,000 bird nests. The effects of Sites Reservoir on wildlife would be almost entirely negative, except for the effects on waterfowl. In conclusion, the board needs to find a way to signal that such century-old and older plans have failed the test of modernity. The board should base its decisions and face the realities of today and the board's responsibilities to comport its decisions to the public trust and the public interest. Stated differently, as one of the tribal representatives expressed it on the September 10th site visit conducted for this proceeding, where does it all stop? If Sites is permitted, which will be the next California Valley or Canyon buried under still another reservoir? Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you, and we look forward to presenting evidence and testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. Please remind me, I have Mr. Mulcahy and Mr. Spain. Which of you would like to present next?
I would be happy to defer to Mr. Mulcahy.
Mr.
Then I
Mulcahy,
would go next.
would you like to present at this time an opening statement?
I can do that.
All right, thank you. Please go ahead.
I'm not quite sure how I can follow those first two, though. They were pretty good. But I'm going to give you the tribal perspective. Good afternoon, Hearing Officer Kenzie and members of the board and fellow participants. My English name is Gary Mulcahy. My Wintu name is Ponte Tiwas. I am the government liaison for the Winnemem Wintu tribe, a participant in the protest of the California Sports Fishing Protection Alliance, Friends of the River et al., of the application and petitions of Sites Project Authority relative to Sites Reservoir. I'm here today to offer an opening statement on behalf of the tribal parties who are also participating in that protest and who will be testifying in these proceedings. I want to begin by talking about legacy. What kind of legacy would you hope to leave behind? One of just and fair treatment? One of equality and opportunity? One where you could look back and say, yes, I made a mistake here or there, but overall I was fair, just, and protective of all those within the area of my influence. That's not the kind of legacy you will hear today. Tribes have come here to tell you of the legacy bestowed upon them from the state of California. A legacy not only of the past, but is still being written today that speaks of death, destruction, displacement, and disregard of tribal peoples, tribal properties, tribal resources, tribal practices, and even tribal spiritual and religious beliefs. You will hear testimony about that historical and ongoing disregard and how that disregard impacts tribal spiritual practices and religious beliefs. You will hear testimony about the immense harm that dams have perpetrated on tribal nations, tribal communities, and the resources needed for the continuance of their cultural practices. You will hear testimony from the tribes, as well as others to follow, about the devastating harms and other means of water management that have caused the native fish populations that are intricate to many of the tribes' cultural, spiritual, and religious beliefs, harms, and devastation to them. You will hear testimony of the historical and ongoing disregard for tribal water rights. And you will hear testimony of the historical and ongoing policies and actions that sought to erase and continue to seek to erase the footprint of Native American tribes throughout the state, no longer with bullets, but with paper decrees and exclusionary practices that lean heavily toward a cultural genocide. It's clear that there's no mitigation measures that can resolve or protect a tribe in its homeland and its spiritual and sacred sites when it's flooded by 200, 300, 400, 500 feet of water. Once that sacred site is immersed under the water, it's no longer available to go to and pray, no longer available for the elders to teach the young ones, this is what we do, this is where we go, this is what we say. It's clear that there's no mitigation measures that can restore historical village sites that are buried under hundreds of feet of water because they are gone. They're not accessible anymore. It's clear that cultural gathering resource sites that are necessary for the continuation of tribal practices such as basket weaving or ceremonial herbs that are done for spiritual and religious practices are no longer available because now they again are under 200, 300, 400 feet of water. There is no mitigation factors that can handle any of that. So for all those reasons, that will be demonstrated within the testimony to be given above. The tribal parties will ask the State Resources Control Board to reject participation. Sorry, I have new teeth, so I'm trying to talk to them. I hope the court reporters is able to understand what I'm saying. Well, the State Water Resources Control Board will reject the applications for the water permit and the assignment of any of the permits that are in support of it. And it is our understanding, it is our concern that it is time to change the narrative of the legacy being written and the State Water Resources Control Board to restore dignity and continuance to the tribes before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Spain, with that, we will turn to you, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Hearing Officer Kinsey, board members and staff, and thank you in advance for all of your hard work here. This is the opening statement of PCFFA et al. And a little bit about our organization. I will go slowly for the reporters' efforts. PCFFA, Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association, is the largest trade organization of commercially fishing families on the West Coast, with many of our people traditionally harvesting Pacific salmon for a living to supply high-quality salmon for America's tables. In short, we feed people just as much as the Central Valley farmers do. Salmon are our crop. Our crop, however, requires cold running water to be kept in the rivers to survive. This is why we are here today at the hearing table, to protect and help restore our once abundant Chinook salmon runs so that our commercial fishing, salmon fishing families can once again make a decent living and their coastal port economies can prosper. The vast majority of salmon we catch all up and down the coast come from freshwater rivers like the Sacramento and other California Central Valley river systems. Even though greatly diminished today in its productivity, the Central Valley still has the potential to once again, as it once was, be the third largest salmon-producing river system in the continental U.S. As you will see from PCFFA testimony, the only salmon stocks in the Central Valley still abundant enough to catch are its fall run and late fall run Chinook salmon, which are also highly migratory once they reach the ocean. This is a fundamental point. Roughly half of all the Chinook salmon harvested in the ocean offshore Oregon come originally from California rivers, mostly from the Central Valley. So what happens to salmon in the Central Valley economically affects much of the West Coast. In short, whether juvenile salmon thrive or barely survive in the Central Valley makes a huge difference to our people and their families. And each year's in-river juvenile survival rate determines whether 3 years later we can fish for returning salmon, adult salmon, or not. Or whether, like in 2023 and 2024, our entire ocean salmon fishery is closed to the great economic loss of our coastal port communities. One of the main driving factors behind decades of Central Valley Chinook salmon declines has been the taking of too much water from the fish, especially in the Sacramento. From PCFFA testimony and the testimony of others, you will hear that the waters of the Sacramento River are already grossly over-appropriated. And this is before even considering the needs for in-river cold water flows for salmon. From the very fact that our once abundant Chinook salmon fishery has been completely closed down through 2023 and 2024, it is clear that, at least under the current water management status quo, these key salmon rivers can no longer support once abundant salmon runs. Today, 2 of the 4 once abundant Central Valley Chinook salmon runs, that is the winter and the spring run, are federally and state ESA listed, with both runs pushed down to very small fractions of their former abundance. The late and late fall, the fall and late fall Chinook salmon runs, which are the only ones we're still allowed to target for harvest, are also in severe depression as well, and are now classified as species of concern by CDFW. Far too little analysis has been done by the CITES Authority on the specific impacts of the CITES project on the fall and late fall runs of Chinook, or on the impacts to our coastal communities and fisheries. Ocean salmon harvests are being closed down more and more often, all because too few salmon eggs and juvenile salmon can survive the Central Valley hot water conditions, which now kill nearly all in many river systems of the juvenile and salmon and eggs. Other young salmon die because during their migration to the sea, including they have to pass fish screens where sweeping flows are too low to avoid entrainment. As you will see from PCFFA testimony and the testimony of others, in all these problems, the lack of flow, water flow, great enough or cold enough to protect these vulnerable young salmon is a major mortality factor. In this light, the CITES authorities comes to us now asking to take another 1.5 million acre feet of water from what surely looks like an already over-appropriated and deeply stressed Sacramento River. Their promise is that some of that water, about 16%, might be made available at the discretion of the Bureau of Reclamation, according to an operations plan that has yet to be written, based on triggering conditions still not agreed upon, to somehow swap in future years for keeping more cold water in Lake Shasta longer, and that this additional Shasta cold water would be at least some positive benefit for winter run Chinook and perhaps other runs of Chinook suffering annually from hot water mortality problems below Shasta Dam. This is all highly speculative. In the modeling done by the CITES Authority, they use the current status quo, that is the no action alternative, the NAA, as its baseline to compare to in all of its efforts to identify likely impacts from the CITES project. This is a statistical trick. But as you will see from our testimony and the testimony of others, the current status quo in our Central Valley rivers is already terrible for salmon. The current status quo is already unacceptable for salmon and the businesses and communities that depend on them. Our view is that adding even just a little more water stress to an already grossly overstressed water system will only drive these severely depressed salmon stocks faster toward extinction. We are nevertheless trying to keep an open mind. Our focus is ensuring healthy salmon populations that result in harvestable ocean abundance. Simply managing to avoid extinction is not enough. We must return to adequate ocean abundance for meaningful and sustainable harvest. However, we acknowledge that, given the right triggers, and if there are enforceable mitigation and habitat restoration measures to offset at least the worst of harms, it is possible that such CITES Shasta water exchanges may prove beneficial to some cold water salmon. But the CITES Authority has still not convinced us that this will be the case, nor has it demonstrated what restrictions on their diversions there will be to protect the migrating salmon, nor how effective these protections will be, nor how any of these supposed mitigation measures would be funded and enforced. We are still awaiting that information. Thank you, and our comments are filed in the record as PCFFA Exhibit 67.
Thank you, Mr. Spain. It is time for us to take a break, but before we do, I just wanted to confirm that there are not any additional parties or additional representatives from the NGO coordinating parties who are planning to make an opening statement. Did I get everyone, Mr. Busher?
So I think that's correct. I just want to give the caveat that because Chairman Mitchum was not available today, the Calusa tribe may have an opening statement, but that will have to
Understood.
come when he is available or at some point in the future. But I think that's correct for everything outside of that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to your knowledge, are your witnesses, we will take a break, but are your witnesses generally available after we come back from about a 10-minute break to begin with the first panel, the summary of directors?
Yes, I saw at least 3 of them by name in the Zoom. I think all 4 are here, and Miss Willie will be doing the direct examination.
Great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Well, we'll do 11 minutes. We'll come back at 10:55.
Excuse me, if I may, can you give me some estimate of when I will be going on to testify? This is Lester Marston.
Yeah, Lester, 15 or 20 minutes after we resume, I think you'll do yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you all at 10:55. It's 10:55. I'll look first to our court reporter. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I believe, I understand, Ms. Willie, you will be presenting the panel of witnesses, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
There you are, great. And then we have Ms. Norris, Mr. Marston, Mr. Mulcahy, and Vice Chair Tayaba. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll look to my team to please pin the witnesses if you would. And then I will administer the oath. Looks like we need Mr. Marston on camera. And Vice Chair Tayaba on camera as well, if you're available. I could also, there we go. We have Mr. Marston, great. Wonderful. We have everyone here. If you would please go off mute, I'm going to administer the oath. So if you would please go off mute and raise your right hand. We have feedback that may be from it. Yep. And if Ms. Norris and Mr. Marston, if you would please go off mute. That way, when you confirm, we can hear you.
Yeah, I turned off my audio.
Well, when you say I, please come off mute so that we can hear you and have it in the record. Okay. Ms. Norris, Mr. Marston, Mr. Mulcahy, and Vice Chair Tayaba, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Thank you.
I do.
Thank you. With that, I will turn to you, Ms. Willie, to start the presentation of these witnesses.
Thank you, and good morning. Mr. Mulcahy, do you have?
I just want to let the hearing officer know that I'll be off camera until my testimony because I have a very weak computer and it kind of gets bogged up if I'm online with video too much. So I just want to let you know that I'm here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And for any of the witnesses, if you would like to go off camera while the other witnesses are providing the summary of direct testimony, you're welcome to, and then we can bring you back up. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Willie.
Thank you. So the purpose of this panel is to introduce concerns within tribal communities regarding project impacts to those tribal communities, including but not limited to impacts to tribal cultural resources, tribal water rights, water quality, and their experiences with tribal consultation. I would like to acknowledge that the tribes participating in this panel today and at a later date for Cachel-Dihe tribe, our sovereign governments, and the panelists and chair people are respected government officials. And I would like to express gratitude to all the panelists for their participation in this hearing. And to start, we will begin with Ms. Sherry Norris. If you could please state your name for the record.
Hi, good morning. I worry about feedback, so just let me know if there's an issue. My name is Sherry Norris. I'm the executive.
I'm sorry, Ms. Norris, there is an echo. I'm not sure what your audio arrangement is there. Do you have more than one device on?
No.
Is there what device? I see you're on mute through the computer screen. Is it possible to mute your other device and do you not have a microphone on the, now we can't hear you at all.
I only have one device. So I can either have it on mute or not mute. I can call in.
Well, I'm looking at your screen on Zoom and it says you're on mute.
That is strange. This is a new Zoom platform that we were required to add when I went in here.
Interesting.
I'm not sure what to do. Muted.
I'm going to ask you to unmute. We'll see what that does. That's a,
Yeah,
that's a
now.
button.
Yeah, now I'm doing this. This is very strange.
Hearing Officer Kinsey.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I know sometimes I have ended up with two Zooms open at once by accident. And I'm wondering if that might be something that happened to Miss Norris.
Yes, so maybe what we can do, Ms. Norris, if you would attempt to leave the Zoom platform and come back in, we will see if you actually leave, because I do see you are here twice according to the participant list. And that may be why we have feedback.
I'll try. Wait, is that working better?
There we go. Now we're fine. That's great.
Okay, I closed every single. Okay, thank you. This is very strange, but okay, good.
Thank you for working through that.
Okay, yeah, my
And
name
back
is
to you,
Sherry
Ms. Norris.
Norris. Try again. Sorry. Oh.
No worries, thank you. And is Exhibit FOR2 an accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
And did you prepare that written testimony?
I did.
And is Exhibit FOR1 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
It is.
And is Exhibit FOR25, which was submitted with your written testimony and cited, a true and correct copy of that documentation?
I believe so. I don't have that up on my screen.
Of course. Okay. And at this time, you can proceed with the summary of your testimony. I don't believe you have a presentation or anything.
No, okay. No, I do not. I have excerpts from the written testimony that I previously provided for you today. So I'll begin. Thank you. Good morning, Hearing Officer Kinsey, State Water Board officers and staff. I am a member of the Osage Nation, and I'm the Executive Director of the California Indian Environmental Alliance. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act promotes tribal self-governance and economic self-sufficiency. This and additional federal and state regulatory statutes, case law, and international conventions.
Ms. Norris, I'm sorry to interrupt. I imagine our court reporter is frantically trying to keep up. Just
I'll go slower.
Hard when you're reading, I know, but if you can please slow down, that would be very helpful.
I will. Thank you. The ISDEA promotes self-governance and economic self-sufficiency. This and additional federal and state regulatory statutes, case law, and international conventions support tribal self-determination and tribal resource management. Projects like the site's reservoir undermine these efforts by threatening tribal continuity as the project impacts the health of the Sacramento River waters. And it has not been adequately proven that the site's reservoir project will not result in an impairment of healthful tribal subsistence foods, medicines, and cultural resources. Such impairments would affect tribal self-determination, creating a barrier to the tribes to protect the health and continuance of their members. Salmon is essential to California Indian tribes for cultural, economic, subsistence, health, and environmental reasons. Crucial to the physical and spiritual health of many California tribes and tribal members, including those in the Sacramento River watershed through to the Pacific Ocean. Control over natural resources, including fish, is connected to the tribe's economic self-sufficiency and the preservation of their members' health and cultural heritage. The principle of federal reserved water rights for California tribes was upheld in Arizona v. California, where the Supreme Court granted permission for tribes to intervene in legal proceedings to protect those rights. The court also amended a prior decree stating that tribes were entitled to more water. Such rights encompass both consumptive and non-consumptive uses, such as fishing and the conditions to support aquatic health and resources. Such rights are not subject to loss by non-use and are protected against subordination or curtailment due to overdraft or other issues. Allowing a new reservoir to be granted water rights before the existing water rights of those tribes and communities who will be negatively affected violates basic first-in-time, first-in-right principles of water rights and prioritization as established under California law. The California Constitution and Water Code emphasize that water use must be reasonable and beneficial, and that waste or unreasonable use is prohibited. In violation of California laws, the unmitigable expected health, cultural, and environmental impacts of the sites project are high, and the evaluation of alternatives is incomplete. For these reasons, granting a water rights change petition to prioritize a new project over the water rights of tribes who will be impaired without proper consideration is unconscionable and may be interpreted as a violation of the established federal and state water rights framework and the protections afforded to water rights under California law and the Federal Reserve Rights Doctrine. Stressors impacting endangered species constitutes a violation of law in California, and the California Endangered Species Act is enforced to protect endangered species from various environmental stressors that could harm. Under the Act, it is prohibited to take, meaning it is prohibited to catch, capture, or kill. Toxins and warm waters are part of that prohibition. It's the creation of them. California Health and Safety Code also addresses violations related to endangered species, including substantial environmental harm or stresses caused by hazardous substances and other activities that could impact endangered species. Case law supports this, highlighting the environmental stressors such as habitat modification and other adverse impacts that must be fully mitigated. For example, Coordination Proceeding Special Title Rule 3.550 versus California Department of Fish and Wildlife, wherein the court found that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife had abused its discretion by not adequately addressing the impacts of habitat modification on endangered species. In the case of the Sites Reservoir, the agencies have not properly addressed the impact on salmon population or considered tribal nations' reliance on endangered species such as salmon for sustainability, subsistence, cultural uses, or economic self-sufficiency. Salmon populations are already at risk from flow diversions for agricultural, urban, and industrial use, reservoirs blocking fish passage and impairing water quality, rising water temperatures, increases in carbon dioxide and methane emissions, and habitat destruction. It has not been proven that the proposed site reservoir will not exacerbate the situation, further affecting tribal communities whose cultural continuance and subsistence is aptly dependent on having access to the healthful waters and traditional foods of their own territory. Salmon species, including Chinook salmon and coho, are listed as threatened or endangered under both California Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act. Low numbers of salmon have resulted in a full closure of ocean and in-river sports fishing in California and Central Valley River basins for 2 consecutive years. Closure means this core subsistence food is not available. Salmon ceremonies cannot be completed, and cultural practices cannot be taught to the younger generations. This effectively blocks cultural continuance and is an extension of genocide. Studies show that decline in salmon populations have been attributed to water projects that deny salmon access to natal streams, cause inadequate water flows, warm water temperature, and create other unfavorable environmental conditions. The site's reservoir will further alter water flows and temperatures, which are critical for salmon migration and spawning, making it more difficult for salmon to recover and thrive. Ongoing actions by multiple agencies and legal actions are being attempted to ensure the survival and resiliency of these species. The Sites Project is in opposition to those efforts, as there is scientific evidence that shows that reservoirs lead to warmer, not colder waters. Wild-caught salmon is an important species for the human health of this, as the species ranks the highest in the most beneficial long-chain omega-3 fatty acids and the lowest in heavy metal bioaccumulation. The natural life cycle of wild salmon enables salmon to be the healthiest, culturally appropriate option for tribal families, especially given our system in California. This species and the 4 seasonal runs are key to the tribal subsistence fishing water quality objective as adopted by the State Water Resources Control Board's resolution 2017 or 2017-0027, which is the Inland Surface Water Enclosed Bays and Estuaries, or ISWEB, where the tribal subsistence objective states the average methyl mercury concentration shall not exceed 0.04 micrograms per kilogram fish tissue within a calendar year. To achieve this, the objectives include eating a mixture of 70% trophic level 3 fish, which includes Chinook salmon, and 30% trophic level 4 fish. It is imperative that anadromous fish like steelhead and salmon remain in the system at sufficient levels to support water quality objectives that are protective of tribal health, and that any project approved by state agencies support the resiliency of salmon in the entire watershed. And this relates to the ISWEB, as I've just read. Sacramento River tribes have been working to establish tribal beneficial uses since before 2010. Tribes in the region joined a statewide effort to include TBUs in the water quality objective, adopted to address mercury by the State Water Resource Control Board in the ISWEB resolution. For 14 years, Central Valley tribes have urged regional boards to adopt the definitions or provisions of the ISWEB into their basin plans. Sacramento River and San Francisco Bay tribes have asked for these definitions to be adopted into the Sacramento River and San Francisco Basin plans, and in collaboration with tribes to designate water bodies with these uses. Unfortunately, the progress has been excessively slow, and the timelines proposed by regional boards remain long, 10 to 15 years or more. Tribes in these basins have requested that the Bay Delta Plan include tribal beneficial uses, and instead the State Water Board deferred to the regional boards to first designate waters and then fold the uses that overlap into future Delta Plan updates. Meanwhile, the site's reservoir and related storage and conveyance projects have been expedited in advance of the State Water Board having the opportunity to gain a clear understanding of tribal uses. Present water quality control plans, however, do include the provision that existing beneficial uses that have not been formally designated in basin plans are protected, whether or not they are identified. Additionally, existing, adopted, and designated and threatened beneficial uses include those related to healthful fish, including cold freshwater habitat, commercial and sports fishing, estuarine habitat, freshwater replenishment, groundwater recharge, fish migration, preservation of rare and endangered species, water contact recreation, shellfish harvesting, fish spawning, and wildlife habitat. Impairments to these uses, those in the ISWEB, and tribal beneficial uses under development do need to be fully considered related to the site's reservoir project. Tribal members must be able to safely gather, use, and share aquatic resources, such as subsistence foods, medicinal plants, and resources for ceremonial uses, traditional structures, vessels, regalia, and fine art. Should the Sacramento River be impaired by site's reservoir, it would increase tribal members to abstain. It would increase the need for tribal members to abstain from eating traditional foods or practicing their culture, either because the resources will no longer be available or because the need to avoid toxins that were introduced or exacerbated by the changes in water quality that may be caused by the project. For women, should their traditional waters be impaired by increased bioavailability of methyl mercury, this means that they must abstain from eating traditional fish until after childbearing age or risk causing their developing babies in utero permanent learning disabilities later in life. Causing their developing babies in utero permanent learning disabilities or in later in life heart disease. Before the site's project proceeds, to avoid conflicts between state and federal water rights and to ensure tribal water rights are respected in full, agencies need to initiate tribal consultation and elicit a comprehensive response to answer the question of how the project will impact all tribes and tribal members from the project area and from the source and receiving waters. To do this, agencies will need to widen the area of outreach, inviting tribes to consult, disclose all potential sources of water that will fill the reservoir, provide information related to all of the associated projects and decisions before regional and state water boards related to the site's reservoir, gather information on the tribal resources that will be impacted by project construction, vegetation alteration, and on the impacts to water quality and aquatic resources from the source through the receiving waters. To fully evaluate how the project will impact water quality, the regional board can begin with evaluating existing beneficial uses as previously adopted in Sacramento River and San Francisco Basin plans for regional and state board consideration, and for tribes and regional boards to continue to work collaboratively and expeditiously to establish water quality objectives that support tribal beneficial uses in the Sacramento and San Francisco Bay Basin plans. While there is background mercury as a global toxin in California, California's mercury concentrations are unique because our primary source is from historic gold mining left over from the California gold rush. Although there are areas that are more toxic than others, all areas of the state are impacted. Once in surface water, in aquatic systems, mercury can mix with decaying plant matter and methylate, becoming more readily available and entering the food chain through microorganisms and increasing in concentration as it bioaccumulate up the food chain. Methylmercury levels of fish in California's rivers, lakes, streams, and in particular in reservoirs can be 1 million times the surrounding waters. Because the creation of reservoirs includes the decay of submerged organic materials, they are the very conditions for mercury to become methylated. The concentration of dissolved organic carbon and pH have a strong effect on the ultimate fate of mercury to methylate in the system. Dissolved organic matter is the underlying driver of lake ecosystem metabolism and trophic status, and plays a significant role in other ecosystem processes, such as controlling nutrients and heavy metal biodiversity and mobility. In order to determine whether or not the site's reservoir project should proceed, analysis, including the EIR, should include an analysis of the content of toxins in the soil, of the toxins that will be developed or resuspended, and of the toxins present in water that the state intends to fill the reservoir with, and what plays a significant role in other ecosystem processes, such as the efforts and the need to control nutrients and heavy metal bioavailability and mobility. We've already heard from colleagues about the global carbon cycle. I just wanted to include, as was part of my testimony, that reservoir construction is increasing globally, and the role of man-made reservoirs and carbon transformations is growing in importance. It has been shown that dissolved organic matter is a major pathway for carbon transfer from terrestrial to aquatic systems. And under the California Environmental Quality Act, environmental impact reports must use the significance of greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide, and their cumulative impacts to the environment, which encompasses fish, wildlife, and tribal resources. In the Center for Biological Diversity versus the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the court found that the assertion in the environmental impact report determination that the project's greenhouse gas emissions would not significantly impact the environment, and this was not supported by substantial evidence. And the court identified that. This indicates that an inadequate analysis of carbon dioxide emissions will lead to legal challenges and the requirement for more thorough environmental reviews. Additionally, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a statutory responsibility to consult with other agencies and provide biological expertise to review and comment on environmental documents and impacts arising from project activities. This includes ensuring that the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on fish and wildlife are adequately considered. The legal impacts of carbon dioxide emissions in fish and wildlife and on tribes in California are significant. and require comprehensive environmental reviews under CEQA. These reviews must include substantial evidence and proper consultation with relevant stakeholders to ensure that the cumulative effects in relation to their processes that cause or exacerbate toxins are adequately addressed. Regarding consultation with California Indian tribes, the legal framework requires coordination with Native American tribes to address potential impacts on cultural resources. In Grassroots Coalition v. California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the court noted that CDFW failed to consult with Native American tribes before certifying the final EIR, which is a necessary step to ensure that tribal resources are protected from environmental impacts, including those from greenhouse emissions, methylation of mercury, increases in water temperature, and other impacts. It is imperative that state agencies consult with tribes in the area where the site's reservoir will obtain its sources of water, in the area where the reservoirs will flood cultural resources, and those tribes who will receive less water or impaired water as it removes water from flow, and those who will receive impaired water from the release of water from site's reservoir or from the maintenance of the reservoir itself, which will resuspend mercury and make it again readily available for the environment and for bioaccumulation. In conversations with tribal staff and leadership of tribes whose members are traditionally from and adjacent to the site's reservoir footprint area, or for whose resources will be impaired, we learned that not all impacted tribes have been fully reached by state agencies and have not been invited to consult. For example, I confirmed with the Round Valley Indian tribes that they have not been invited to consult, and information about the project has not been disclosed in enough detail to fully evaluate the impact of the project for their members, whose traditional territories do include the site's reservoir project area. Consultation should be conducted in good faith and include all provisions of the related state and federal executive orders, including AB 52, SB 18, U.S. Executive Order 13175, and California Executive Order B1011. Increasingly, California tribes are adopting their own consultation practices, and I encourage the agencies to reach out to tribes first and to actually consult meaningfully. This means that the expertise and needs expressed by tribal staff and leadership are considered with great care and shown to be clearly incorporated into the decisions made by state agencies. Anything less is merely informational and is not consultation. Lastly, I wanted to bring up Executive Order N 1519. Because of the timeliness of the Truth and Healing Council projects of the state should also correspond with a concerted effort to no longer force California tribes to accept policies, procedures, and activities that will continue to destroy subsistence foods, tribal resources, cultural continuance, and tribal self-determination. It would be appropriate, given the stated part of the main goals of the Truth and Healing Council, to envision a path forward for processes and projects approved by the state to exemplify tenets of free and prior informed consent, as outlined in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to actively listen to California tribes who are asking for more sustainable and effective management strategies. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, and appreciate it.
Back to you, Ms. Willie.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Norris. And next, I'd like to have Lester Marston pinned to the screen.
Good afternoon. I'm Les Marston. And by way of some background information, I'm a prior Superior Court Judge Pro Tem for the Mount Sanhedrin Judicial District. I was a city attorney for the city of Willits for 10 years. But I have spent all of my life practicing in the area of federal Indian law and defending the tribe's rights to enact their own laws and to be ruled by them on their own reservations. I've brought numerous suits to hold the United States government accountable to fulfill their trust obligations that they owe to Indian tribes, and have constantly sued the state and the governor. Just filed suit last Friday against the governor yet again in federal court for violations of federal law. What I do in a nutshell is I try to defend tribal sovereignty. I don't think you can make a decision here for two reasons.
Mr. Marston, can I pause you for a moment? I believe Ms. Willie is going to have you affirm your written testimony, which is an important step here. And then we can get into it. Thank you.
I affirm my written testimony, and you have my written testimony. I'm not a big one to read to people.
You don't need to read, but let's identify, maybe Ms. Willie, you can help me. Is this the written testimony for Mr. Marston is SCS 3? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think you can make a decision in this matter for two reasons. Number one, you don't have the information necessary to make an informed decision. And number two, you haven't engaged in adequate consultation with the tribes as required by the governor's executive orders. And I'd like to just quickly address the first one. Tribes have a reserved right to appropriate groundwater and surface waters that are located below, hydrologically connected to waters that lie below, and surface waters that lie within the boundaries of their reservations. They have a priority date under the doctrine of prior appropriation. Most tribes' reservations are created within the Aboriginal territories they were occupied. And if that's the case, they have a priority date of March 1st, 1853, under the March 1st, 1853 statute, which means their priority date is the first in time, which gives them the first in right. And when their reservations were created, that reserved that to them the right to appropriate as much water as was necessary to fulfill the purposes for which the reservation was created. Now, how much water is that? Well, until there's a general stream adjudication quantifying that right, we know that the tribes have the right and to appropriate, and this includes, but is not limited to, enough water for domestic water use, commercial development, irrigate practical irrigable acreage for agricultural development, maintain fisheries, and I want to emphasize that, maintain a fishery, maintain endangered species, maintain flora and fauna for cultural and religious purposes, and maintain a healthy watershed that will maintain their groundwaters on a sustained yield basis. So you have tribes that have reservations that lie downstream from the diversion point that you've been asked to approve on the Sacramento River. What do you know about those tribes? What do you know about their water right? And just because a reservation is small doesn't mean that they don't have a huge water right. And let me just give you an example. Rizzagini Ranchery on the Klamath River has a really small reservation, about 200 acres. But they have the right to maintain a fishery. And that means the right to maintain enough flow in the river for critical up and outstream migration of anadromous fish. That means to maintain enough water in the river to maintain a healthy temperature so spawning can take place. And that could be a huge amount of water. That could be thousands of acres, acre feet of water. So the first question I'm asking you is, how many tribes are downstream from this diversion point on the Sacramento River? And how much water do they have the right to take out of that river? What do you know about them? I can tell you this, most of the tribes are coming late to the game, right? Because they haven't had the money and the resources to do what was necessary, which was to do a comprehensive watershed management study, to do a comprehensive groundwater management study, so that groundwaters could be maintained on a sustained yield basis. Do you know how much water that is for these tribes? Yet you're going to issue a permit to allow somebody upstream from them to divert waters? I've been representing the Chemehuevi Indian tribe on the Colorado River in a general stream adjudication of the Colorado River since 1977. And everybody thought back in 1977 that there would be huge abundance of water on the Colorado River. I'm sure you're aware what happened on the Colorado River this year. For the first time during drought conditions, people started invoking the decree. For the first time, people started going in and asking the court to turn other people's waters off. Yeah, there might be an abundance of water in the Sacramento River today, but with climate change and other things that are happening, a year from now, 5 years from now, there could be drought conditions on the Sacramento River. And the tribes that are downstream on the Sacramento could be going into federal court, and it won't be state court on the McCarran Amendment, I can assure you, because what Congress gave under the McCarran Amendment, Congress took away in Public Law 280. So they're going to be going into federal court, and they'll be seeking injunctions to stop people from doing upstream diversions that you may be approving today in violation of their federally reserved water right. And those are waters that are owned by the United States of America in trust for the tribes. So you don't know. You don't have the information to make an informed decision. In addition, you haven't consulted with the tribe.
Ms. Kinsey?
Yes.
I sincerely apologize for interrupting, but it's my expectation here that Mr. Marston is prepared to jump into testimony that's not contained in his written testimony. He has nothing in his written testimony about consultation. And he just provided you some other examples of testimony that are not within his written testimony. I'm not familiar with this Rezzigini Rancheria, or I apologize for the...
It's a hypothetical example. I mean, I could give you, instead of Rezzigini...
Mr. Marston.
My point is, I think you're about to hear testimony, it sounds like, that's not in his written testimony. He's provided examples that were not in his written testimony. So I object to the extent he's doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. And Mr. Marston, let me clarify what the scope of your testimony is here. Everything that you can provide in the summary of your direct testimony must be in your written testimony. So to the extent your examples exceed what's written in your testimony here in front of me, we can't go there.
Well, testimony talks Federal Reserve water rights, and all I was doing was giving you an example. I can make it a specific example on the Sacramento if you want.
I don't want any examples that aren't in your written testimony. Your written testimony is the absolute limit of the testimony you can provide today.
Okay.
And I appreciate the summary, but I do want to give you that warning so we can stay within the scope here, please.
Well, that's my summary. My summary is that you don't have the information necessary to make an informed decision. And in order to get that information, you need to consult with the tribes. And you need to consult with the tribes in conformity with the governor's executive orders on tribal consultation, which encourages every state agency and department to meaningfully communicate and consult with California tribes. That's my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Marston. I will turn back to you, Ms. Willie, to call you the next witness on this panel, please.
Thank you. Next, we will have Mr. Mulcahy, and I will run through some questions for you. First, can you please state your name for the record?
My English name is Gary Mulcahy. My Wintu name is Ponte Tiawas. I'm the government liaison for the Winnemem Wintu tribe and have held that position for about 31 years.
And could you spell your Winnemem Wintu name for the reporter, please?
Ponte, Ponti, space, Tiawas, capital T, EWIS.
Thank you. And is Exhibit FOR 4 an accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
And did you prepare that written testimony?
Yes, I did.
And is Exhibit FOR 24 an accurate summary presentation of your written testimony?
I believe so.
And did you prepare that summary presentation?
Yes.
And is Exhibit FOR 3 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
It's an accurate statement of some of my qualifications, but I didn't want to ramble on.
Thank you. And are Exhibits FOR 35 to FOR 37, which were submitted with your written testimony and cited, a true and correct copy of those documents?
Yes, they are. I viewed them today.
Okay, thank you. And so at this time, Ms. Mullen, if you could bring up FOR 24, and you may proceed with the summary. Thank you.
First, I want to thank the hearing office and the board members for being present, and the other participants. And I really want to thank Ms. Mullen because I have been following the hearings for a couple of weeks now, and you're amazing. Yeah, there's exhibits that people talk about, and you go and find them somewhere in the nether, and then boom, there they are. So really appreciate it. So my presentation, my summary is going to include several exhibits which were talked about. And I'll start by saying Sites Reservoir builds on the death and destruction of the Winnemem Wintu tribe. Ponte Tiwas, that's me, member government liaison. Next slide, please. To the state of California, long have you prospered on the backs of the indigenous peoples. From the time this state was conceived up to the including this very day, you, the state of California, lobbied in Congress to make sure the treaties were never ratified because you wanted all the resources for yourself. You, the state of California, paid $5 a head for native scalps because you didn't want us here. You, the state of California, have destroyed millions of acres of indigenous cultural lands, which included sacred sites, village sites, burial grounds, and medicinal gathering areas by allowing them to be paved over, dug up, planted over, dammed up, flooded out, logged out, siphoned off, or polluted to beyond uninhabitable. Next slide, please. This water permit application builds on and enables the continuation of that legacy of death and destruction. It will help energize and justify projects that should not be done. It will accelerate the march to species extinction and will allow the perpetuation of cultural genocide. Next slide, please. Winnemem Wintu, this is our territory. We, of course, are not sitting next to the Sites Project Authority, but we are at the headwaters of where the Sites Project Authority are going to receive their flows from. Our territory is behind now Shasta Dam. The death and destruction began in the 1800s when the treaties were not ratified. And this, and it would continue. Next slide, please, sorry. With the construction of Shasta Dam, what started it was CVP Indian Lands Acquisition Act and the construction of Shasta Dam. The act took all the Indian lands within the area embraced by the CVP with precision set for compensating those affected. Winnemem Wintu were removed from the area by virtue of their homes being bulldozed down. Water flooded the village areas and sacred sites from filling the reservoir. Requirements per the act were never fulfilled. No compensation was provided for the 4,480 acres of lands that were taken, nor were any other lands acquired to replace the lands that were taken. Over 90% of historical village sites, sacred sites, burial sites, cultural areas were inundated by Shasta Reservoir. Shasta Dam is known as the keystone of the CVP to California and federal agencies. To us, it is known as a weapon of mass destruction, the tool to destroy our culture and the means to exterminate a species. Dams equal weapons of mass destruction. Next slide, please. This water right application and proposed project are a continuation of what has come before regarding the CVP and SWP and other attempts to engineer California water for the benefit of large Central and Southern California water and agricultural agencies, while disregarding TBUs, tribal water rights, environmental impacts, and devastating impacts on already endangered fish species. Next slide, please. In June of this year, the Department of Interior put out a historic ongoing report on historic ongoing impacts of federal dams on the Columbia River Basin tribes. This was published by the U.S. Department of Interior. For the first time, the U.S. government acknowledges that harmful role has played over the past century in building and operating dams and have devastated Native American tribes by inundating their villages and decimating salmon runs. Sites Reservoir is no exception. Could you pull up, Ms. Mullen, could you pull up FOR 36, please? Thank you. And we'll go to page 6. I believe it's executive summary. Yeah, you scroll down there. Now, I'm not going to read this executive summary to you word for word, but it basically lays out the fact that federal and non-federal dams have affected and caused harm to Native American tribes throughout their process. Now, this report, of course, is on the Columbia River Basin, but you can add any watershed name into this report and any tribes' names into this report that are affected by a dam built anywhere in the United States. The harms to the cultural resources, the tribal cultural practices, the fish, the first foods is the same, no matter if you're in Washington, Oregon, California, Maine, Arizona, whatever. The tribes were disproportionately harmed. The federal and non-federal dams on the Columbia River and Lower Snake River transform the river functions from those the tribes rely on to those serving other economic ends, transferring wealth away from the tribes. This is the case anywhere you find a dam, a tribe that is affected by a dam that has affected and basically closed off their waterway. That is the purpose of me giving the explanation about 55 Stat 612 and the construction of Shasta Dam and how it has affected our tribe, because we can personally attest to what the damage does to tribes, to tribal cultural resources. So I'm not going to, without going page to page of the report, I will summarize some of the major findings contained within regarding impacts dams have had on Native American tribes. Federal and non-federal dams have flooded hundreds of thousands of acres of tribal lands, village sites, burial sites, religious sites, cultural gathering sites, and severely impacting access to first foods such as salmon. These dams were built for the purpose of extracting wealth and economic gain, such as providing electricity, water for irrigation, navigation, and other benefits to regional industries, while simultaneously contributing to the decline of salmon populations, degradation of natural resources, and disregard for the impacts on tribal lands, cultural practices, resources, and even spiritual beliefs and practices. The Sites Reservoir project is not immune to this critique. Its proposed construction site lies on the historical lands of the Catchal-Dehe Band of Wintoon Indians. And you'll hear more of that when Chairman Mitchum testifies later on, but it is contained in his testimony right now, which is FOR 8. Site's purpose is financial gain, despite the devastating impacts it will have on tribal cultural resources, spiritual sites, burial sites, historical village sites, and tribal cultural practices that have continued from time immemorial. Can you pull up FOR 35, please, Ms. Mullen? Appreciate it. Yeah, let me see where I wanted to go here. Page 10, the bottom left, please. I'll show you the title of this if you need. It's the McCloud River Indians and the Baird Fish Hatchery on the McCloud, a history that was done regarding the Winnemem-Wintu tribe, my tribe, and Livingston Stone, who is a fish culturist who was commissioned to make a fishery on the western United States. But my point I want to bring out here is we've heard testimony before from other individuals about the abundance of salmon or the abundance calculation that is done and whether or not harms will be to salmon. And in 1875, Stone states that they were so thick in the river in July that we counted 100 salmon jumping out of the water in the space of a minute, making 6,000 to be actually seen in the air in an hour. Nearly 9 million eggs were taken, and there were more to be had for the taking. And even more impressively, in 1878 was the year of the immense gathering of salmon in the McCloud River. Stone is cited, and top of this page on the right, please. I have never seen anything like it anywhere, not even on the tributaries of the Columbia. On the afternoon of the 15th of August, there was a space in the river where if a person could have balanced himself, he could actually have walked anywhere on the backs of the salmon. They were so thick. This leads me to say that the most extraordinary feature about the fishing season this year was that the salmon in the river did not seem to be diminished by our constant signing. We made enormous hauls with the net every day, spawned a large number of salmon, and gave a large number to the Indians for their winter supply. But always the next day, the spawning salmon seemed to be thick as ever. And the last one I'm going to refer to here is the next paragraph down. During the time, the 40 days before October 5, we caught and examined one by one nearly 200,000 salmon. We took and impregnated at least 14 million eggs. That is what you determine the definition of abundance is, not the definition of a species on the verge of extinction. Can we go to my testimony now, page 6, please, Ms. Mullen? At FOR 4, sorry. The purpose of showing you the Baird Fish Hatchery is the fact that they transferred eggs, eyed eggs, all the way across the world, and also were done in order to try and replenish Atlantic seaboard rivers that had been depleted from the salmon. Those salmon eggs were planted in England, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, many places, but they didn't take anywhere other than in New Zealand. The first consignment of 25,000 eggs went to New Zealand in 1874, with an additional 50,000 salmon eggs were sent from the McCloud Station Baird Hatchery to New Zealand and Australia. Through the ensuing years, these continued to be shipped to New Zealand all the way up to 1907. Now, this is based on U.S. Fish Commission reports that Stone, U.S.F. references 1871 and 1907. Now, in New Zealand, a country where no salmon once existed in the rivers, now has a teeming salmon runs throughout the year in all its rivers, thanks to the Baird Fish Hatchery and the Winnemem-Wintu that worked there. While here at home in California, our salmon are inching ever closer to extinction. The winter run and spring run Chinook once thrived in vast numbers, but with a loss of hundreds of miles of historical spawning grounds in the upper Sacramento and McCloud watersheds, the runs are now just a soft echo of what they once were. Can you scroll down a little bit, please? In 1875, Livingston Stone attested to this report. I've already talked about those, so I won't do those quotes again, but can you go to page 12, please, Ms. Mullen? And in 2008, NOAA Fisheries issued a biological opinion on long-term operations criteria and plan, the OCAP. Excuse me, and found that water pumping operations in California Central Valley by the Bureau of Reclamation jeopardized the continued existence of several threatened and endangered species under the jurisdiction of NOAA Fisheries. Federal biologists and hydrologists concluded that current water pumping operations in the federal CVP and state water project should be changed to ensure survival of winter run and spring run Chinook salmon. Central Valley still had the southern population of North American green sturgeon and southern resident killer whales, which rely on Chinook salmon runs for food. In arriving at a reasonable and prudent alternative to improve the chances of survival for the designated ESUs, which is evolutionary significant units, NIMPs, could you scroll down a little bit, please? NIMPs concluded that analysis shown that even after discretionary actions are taken to operate Shasta and Folsom reservoirs to reduce adverse effects on water operations on listed anadromous fish, the risk of temperature-related mortality of fish and eggs persists, especially in critically dry years. This mortality is to be significant. I can't see part of it because of the faces on Facebook, so that's okay. This mortality is will be significant at the population level. The analysis also led to the conclusion that due to climate change, the frequency of these critically dry years will increase. And that determination is an FOR 37 biological opinion and conference opinion on the long-term operations of the Central Valley Project State Water Project. That's 2009. I won't pull that up, but it's available if you want to look at it. It's 900 pages long. If you scroll down a little bit, please. NIMS concluded that it believes it necessary for reclamation and other fisheries agencies and DWR in cooperation with NIMS to undertake a program to provide fish passage above the rim dams, such as Shasta and Folsom, to reintroduce winter run, spring run, Central Valley steelhead back into the historical habitats above the dams. NIMS believes that the higher elevation areas of suitable habitat will provide a refuge for, I can't see this here, for cold water fish in the face of climate change. You scroll down a little bit, please. Since the issuance of the 2009 biological opinion, there has been the release of a new biological opinion in 2019. The new biological opinion did not negate the need to reintroduce salmon populations in the higher elevation areas of suitable habitat for cold water fish. I bring this up because I've discussed Baird Fish Hatchery. I've discussed the salmon eggs being put over into New Zealand and the success of the plantation of the winter run and spring run salmon in New Zealand, and they're abundant now. But currently, we are experiencing a critical population level of winter run salmon in the Sacramento watershed. And since the issuance of the NIMS 2009 biological opinion, the Winnemem-Wintu tribe has been working to reintroduce winter run Chinook salmon back into the McCloud River to its historical spawning habitat. In 2022, the Winnemem-Wintu began a partnership with NOAA Fisheries, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Resources, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to begin placing eyed eggs into incubation facilities on the McCloud River. As these eggs hatch and grow, the juvenile salmon are collected downstream in a juvenile collection system, gathered and then placed into the Sacramento River below Shasta Dam. In 2023, the Winnemem-Wintu signed a historic agreement with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for co-management of the project and signed an agreement with NOAA Fisheries for co-stewardship of the project. Scroll down a little bit, please.
Mr. Mulcahy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I read your testimony right before this panel. So there's no need to read directly what you have written here. We have that in the evidentiary record. I've read it. I'm somewhat familiar. But if you have anything else to summarize, I want you to feel free to do that. But there is no need to read the testimony directly. Thank you.
And the reason why I mentioned the reintroduction efforts and the juvenile salmon being placed in the Sacramento River is that we believe that Sites Reservoir will not help us meet the goals of reintroduction. The answer is simply no to us, that the additional diversions from the Sacramento River, the additional ability to entrain or entrap juvenile fish at water intakes, and higher water temperature release back into the Sacramento, increased toxicity from the stored releases, and the destruction of tribal cultural resources all point to a big no approving the Sites Authority's water right permit application. Last slide of my FOR 24, please. Sorry, hearing officer.
No problem. Thank you.
I got carried away. And the last thing we would like to say is that at any and all determinations of existing water rights allocated or changes thereto, modifications thereof, or issuance of new, we believe are illegal on their face and should be suspended, voided, or enjoined until such time as inherent water rights of the indigenous people of this state are recognized, allocated, protected, preserved first and foremost, before and above any and all other claims of water in the state of California. That completes my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Mulcahy.
Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you. At this point, we're at 11:57, but for the convenience of all of us, I wanted to turn to Ms. Willie and Vice Chair Tayaba. Do you have a preference as to whether you summarize your direct testimony now, or should we wait until after our lunch break? I'm open either way. I wanted to see if you had a preference.
Personally, I would appreciate it if we go now, just because mine really isn't that long.
Great, that sounds wonderful. With that, I will turn things over to you, Ms. Willie, if you're going to introduce Vice Chair Tayaba. And Vice Chair Tayaba, thank you in advance for your summary of your testimony. Please go ahead.
If you could please state your name for the record. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Hi, I'm Melissa Tayaba, Vice Chair for Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians.
And is Exhibit FOR 6 an accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that written testimony?
Yes.
And is Exhibit FOR 26 an accurate statement or accurate summary presentation of your written testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that presentation?
Yes.
And is Exhibit FOR 5 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes.
And is Exhibit FOR 40, which was submitted with your written testimony and cited, a true and correct copy of that document?
Yes.
Okay. And if at this time, Ms. Mullen, if you could bring up FOR 26, please, and then you can go ahead with your summary presentation.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I guess I'm ready to begin. Sorry, I'm on my cell phone, so it's just hard for me to see. My name is Melissa Tayaba. I am from the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, and I am here today. If you can move to the next slide. So Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, we are Nisenan Pewanan people, Miwok, Maidu, and also Hawaiian ancestry. My people come from the American River, the Sacramento River, up to the Feather River. Our Aboriginal territory spans 7 different counties, and obviously water is going through all of them. And these lands are very important to us because we are connected to these lands, and these lands provided everything that my elders needed, and of course that the tribe needs now. Next slide. For my tribe, the interaction somewhere around 1850 is when my tribe is deeply affected by Sutter himself, where we are actually removed from our homelands. We're kept out by private land ownership and state and federal water resource development in the Delta region. We were removed actually about 40 miles east to where the Shingle Springs Rancheria is located now. And so that map is really just a picture to show you we were at the river, but the state puts us about 40 miles away. And we're a tribe of about 600 people, and half of them being children. Next slide. And so we found our traditional ecological knowledge program within the tribe somewhere around 2017. And really what that was for is because we really needed to teach our young ones who we are, where we come from, and our culture. One of the most exciting things that has happened for us is about three years ago, we were able to purchase back our village of Wolok, also known as Verona, which is at the confluence of the Feather and the Sacramento River. Next slide. And once again, that's just a map with the 2 red dots showing our original village site and then where we were removed to. Next slide. So the destruction of the Delta obviously has a huge impact on the tribes. For me personally, I am a dancer, I am a weaver. Obviously back home, our program, we need the river for all of the activities that we do, from our traditional regalia, just to our seasonal dancing, just all of the food, everything that we need as Indian people comes from the river. And the things that have been affecting us are things like fish, things like the algal blooms, and the toxins and E. coli. E. coli and the blooms have greatly impacted my community because one of our village sites is hugely impacted by E. coli. In Verona, we actually had to, next slide, we actually had to cancel some of our dances, some of our ceremonies because of the water condition. And so this slide is really just talking about meaningful and robust consultation, in which my tribe was actually not consulted on this project. And I just wanted to point out, obviously, Biden's direction and, you know, he ensuring that federal agencies conduct regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal officials. Next slide. tribal beneficial uses are of vital importance to the tribes in the Bay Delta. And I believe that the State Water Board has an opportunity to get us on an even playing field when it comes to tribal beneficial uses and designate that for tribal people. Everything else has been designated, but except for what tribes need. And I think that it's important to say that that designation obviously would not only benefit tribes, but it would benefit all people. And the Sites Authority must recognize TBUs and incorporate analysis of impacts to such resources into the project planning. Next slide. Sites Reservoir is a threat to tribes and it will have a negative impact on tribes. With the continuing decline in water quality of the Delta, perpetuates the legacy of colonization, marginalization, and genocide. The Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians are survivors of disease, colonization, genocide, and removal. Sites Reservoir poses an additional threat to the tribe's people, culture, and traditions. I fear that the resources and landscapes we are working so hard to restore our connection to will become increasingly unsuitable for use or disappear altogether. Such loss would amount to cultural genocide for our tribe. Next slide. And so in conclusion, I believe that the site's project application to appropriate water should be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Ms. Willie, I'll turn to you. Does that complete the presentation with understanding that Chairman Mitchum couldn't join us today, but complete the presentation of direct summaries of testimony from their first panel of witnesses?
Yes, for today.
For today, yes, thank you. With that, let's go ahead and take a break for lunch. My plan would be to come back at 1 o'clock. Before we break, are there any issues that we need to address? All right, with that, then let's break until 1 o'clock. You will need to re-sign into the Zoom platform, and we will see you then. Thank you very much.